The operational map displayed on the main screen showed 43 red indicators pulsing and active across Harris, Fort Bend, Brazoria, Galveston, and Jefferson counties. 1,200 federal agents were in the field, 60 SWAT teams were deployed, 18 Black Hawk helicopters were maintaining aerial coverage. DIA tactical units and ice strike teams were operating simultaneously on multiple fronts. And along the Gulf Coast itself, 2 United States Navy patrol vessels were running maritime interdiction operations, specifically targeting Sinaloa cartel shipping routes, moving through international waters toward the Texas coastline. The mission had evolved. It now carried a new name and a dramatically expanded scope. A desert compound situated outside Rosenberg was identified as a methamphetamine superlab producing approximately 400 kilograms of the drug per week. Federal teams breached the compound, neutralized the operation, and destroyed the facility. A luxury estate in the Woodlands yielded 3 senior cartel logistics commanders and a personal safe containing $9 million in physical currency. A border tunnel discovered beneath an industrial property in Laredo was one of the most elaborate underground smuggling passages investigators had ever encountered. Complete with rail tracks, permanent electrical lighting, and a ventilation system of sufficient complexity that its construction must have required years of covert engineering work beneath the surface. The tunnel was collapsed and permanently sealed. A human trafficking transit house in Galveston was hit at first light. 47 survivors were recovered from within the structure. On Iron I-10, a migrant smuggling convoy was intercepted by federal units. 12 traffickers were taken into custody, and 31 individuals were found packed inside a trailer without ventilation, in temperatures exceeding 90 degrees. By midday, the operational totals had reached staggering figures. 8.4 tons of narcotics seized, $67 million in cash and assets frozen, 340 arrests, 89 firearms recovered, and 14 armored vehicles confiscated. From inside one of the arrest transport vans, a cartel logistics coordinator known only by his operational alias, Tress, pressed his face against the mesh partition and looked out at the federal building beyond the window. He said quietly, "To no one in particular, you only got the bottom floor." No one in the vehicle laughed, because at that precise moment, the analysts back at the field office had just breached the final encrypted layer of the server system. And what rendered itself on that screen made the entire preceding 14 months of investigation feel like the opening chapter of a story that was only now truly beginning. By every visible and measurable standard, the operation had been an unqualified success. 340 arrests, 8.5 tons of controlled substances removed from circulation. Justice, by all appearances, had been delivered. The network had been dismantled. The cartel infrastructure within Southeast Texas had been broken apart. Or so the command team believed. The final file contained within the blueprint folder was not a financial document. It was not a ledger, a balance sheet, or a record of transactions. It was a roster. 23 Houston area law enforcement officers, 7 Border Patrol agents, 4 sitting judges, 11 state legislators. Every single name on that list had been receiving regular monthly payments. The funds routed through the same shell company architecture that had already been identified, disguised as fees associated with legitimate legal consulting contracts. Border Patrol agents whose names appeared on the roster had been systematically falsifying their own patrol route logs, deliberately creating invisible corridors of unmonitored territory timed to coincide precisely with Sinaloa convoy movement windows. The judges listed had been dismissing cartel-connected cases at the earliest possible procedural stage, at the motion level, before any evidence could be formally presented to the court. The legislators had quietly and methodically buried 3 separate asset seizure reform bills in committee over a 4-year period, ensuring that the legal mechanisms most capable of disrupting cartel financial infrastructure never came to a vote. A deputy sheriff watched his sergeant, someone he had worked alongside for years and trusted implicitly, being walked out of the precinct building in handcuffs. A court clerk who had processed hundreds upon hundreds of Judge Mercer's sealed orders sat in an FBI interview room and wept uncontrollably for 20 minutes before she was able to compose herself enough to speak. An honest and experienced Border Patrol supervisor who had filed 3 separate internal complaints about suspicious activity within his unit, complaints that had been received, acknowledged, and then quietly buried without follow-up, stood outside the command center in the morning light and said absolutely nothing. He simply watched, in silence, as the full scope of what had been happening around him came into focus. This was not a scandal of isolated misconduct. This was not a few individuals who had gone astray from an otherwise sound institution. This was a parallel system, a second shadow infrastructure that had been deliberately and methodically constructed, that answered not to the Constitution of the United States or to the public it was ostensibly serving, but to the operational directives and financial interests of the Sinaloa cartel. And then the identity of the silent partner, the architect above Judge Mercer, was confirmed. It was not a politician. It was not another judge. It was a recently retired regional director of the district attorney's office, Gordon Harwell Pace. He was the individual who had personally authorized and signed off on the federal contractor credentials used to build the server encryption infrastructure that had protected the entire operation for over a year. His access codes remained active and functional in 3 separate government databases even after his retirement. Over the course of 11 years, in a position of significant institutional authority, Pace had occupied a vantage point that allowed him to review every major interdiction and enforcement plan before it was launched. Not after, not in retrospect, but before in time to act on that knowledge. He was taken into custody at a golf resort in Scottsdale, Arizona at 2:14 in the afternoon. He said nothing, not a word, not a protest of innocence, not a demand for counsel, not a single syllable. But here is what Pace had already set into motion in the period before his arrest was executed. Analysts discovered it on a cloud storage partition connected to a device registered under his wife's name. 3 additional metropolitan distribution corridors, Dallas, San Antonio, and New Orleans, had each been furnished with their own version of the blueprint, the same shell company financial architecture, the same judicial access and case dismissal strategy, the same Border Patrol integration model. All 3 networks were already fully operational, already moving product through their respective corridors, already protected by the same layers of institutional corruption that had shielded Houston for over a year. They hadn't simply infiltrated the federal enforcement apparatus, they had franchised a model for corrupting it. And taking down Houston had done nothing to slow the other 3 cities. It had merely illuminated how many more were already functioning on the same blueprint, under the same protection, and beyond the reach of what Houston's investigators had been able to see. In Harris County last year, 2,400 individuals died from drug overdoses. 61% of those deaths involved fentanyl. That has since been forensically traced back to this specific distribution network, the one that judges signed off on protecting, that law enforcement officers were paid to shield, and that legislators were compensated to ensure would never face meaningful legal reform. 89 human trafficking survivors were recovered across the various raid sites associated with this operation. Investigators believe that more than 200 additional individuals who passed through this network remain unaccounted for. One mother, whose 23-year-old son died after consuming a single fentanyl pill he had been told was a prescription painkiller, spoke about what had been taken from her. He had no idea what he was actually ingesting. No one had warned him about what was inside the pill. No one in the entire chain of corruption, from the cartel cells that manufactured it, to the protected distribution network that moved it, to the street-level dealers who sold it, had done anything to stop it from reaching him. He died not knowing what killed him. A trafficking survivor recovered from the Galveston Transit House had been held in captivity for 11 days. When agents brought her outside into the open air for the first time since her detention, she turned to the nearest agent and asked a single question, quietly, carefully, as though she genuinely wasn't certain of the answer. She asked whether she was actually free. This is not merely a story about crime. It is a documented and operational blueprint for the systematic corruption of democratic institutions at every level: judicial, legislative, and law enforcement. It happened in Houston. It is happening right now in Dallas, San Antonio, and New Orleans, and potentially in cities beyond those 3 that investigators have not yet reached. Power, when it reaches a sufficient level of sophistication, does not announce itself through explosions or gunfire. Sometimes all it requires is silence, a judicial signature on a sealed order, and the calculated willingness of the right people to look in a different direction. If you followed this story to its conclusion, you are paying attention to something that the majority of people never look closely enough to see. Sharing this story means it reaches people who need to understand that systemic corruption of this nature is not theoretical, not historical, and not confined to distant places or abstract institutions. The 3 additional cities, Dallas, San Antonio, and New Orleans, are operating under the same network framework and the same blueprint. That investigation is the subject of the next chapter, and what it reveals is, by every account from those who have already reviewed the files, darker than what Houston uncovered. Gordon Harwell Pace the architect who built the framework that protected all of it, requested a deal from federal prosecutors on the second day of his detention. What he placed on the table in exchange for a consideration of immunity is a question that investigators are still actively evaluating and have not yet disclosed. That story is still being written. Part 2 is coming.